You're listening to the Career Musician Podcast with creator and host, Nomad. With 20 plus years of experience in the music industry, Nomad has done just about everything to earn a living as a career musician. From being music director to celebrity artists, playing iconic arenas and stadiums, composing for film and TV, and even playing your average local club gigs, he's done it all. Nomad's mission is to empower musicians across the globe with strategies for a sustainable career while blasting stereotypes, and to bring you tried and true wisdom from his colleagues in this crazy business we call music.
Marta Sofia Honer, violinist and violist, has played with the likes of Mariah Carey, BTS, Kamasi Washington, Portugal the Man, Miss Lauryn Hill, Ariana Grande, and according to me, yes me, I have dubbed her Beyonce's secret weapon. Well, in addition, Marta is an LA session player for film and TV. You can hear her awesome string work on the last season of The Good Place and many, many more. Without further ado, Marta Sofia Honer. Okay, we welcome Marta Honer today to the Career Musician Podcast. Marta, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. So with guests such as yourself that I don't know personally and I don't know much about other than checking out your amazing work online, I like to start off just by saying, hey, what you up to, where you're from, the whole 9 yards, and just a quick little excerpt here.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm a string player, obviously based in, or not so obviously, for our podcast listeners across the world, based in Los Angeles. I moved here 6 years ago from Chicago. I'm originally from the Midwest, and I grew up in a fairly musical family. My mom runs a violin school, and so I grew up playing violin and then added viola in there and was basically kind of groomed to be a musician and, more specifically a classical musician my whole life. But then have since obviously, diversified. And now I do a lot of session work and a lot of work with artists in a ton of different genres.
That is so cool. First of all, I have to say that I'm a little bit jealous of the fact that you were groomed to be a classical musician. That's something that I always, hoped for.
Sure.
But I never went there all the way. You know how you say you can't serve more than one master, meaning, you can't have more than one focus point, really. Mm-hmm. It seems like the classical world is such an endeavor, a lifelong endeavor that you have to devote a lot of time to.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So how did you find that for yourself? Yeah.
I felt like I fit into that model and story and also didn't fit in, which is why I think the move to LA and the choices I've made on what to try to get my fingers into have worked out so well. So even as a teen, when I was practicing all the time and playing in youth symphonies and learning chamber music and doing concerto competitions, I was also playing in a post-rock band, and we were recording and writing our own material, and I was going to shows all the time.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and then same thing in college. I was always going out to shows of all kinds in the city and trying to play with as many different bands and whatnot as possible beyond, the primary orchestral training.
Okay, beyond the norm. Now, When you say post-rock band, what do you mean by that exactly?
Post-rock, so super long form, predominantly instrumental tunes.
Nice.
We won our youth battle of the bands and was able to cut a full record.
How awesome is that? Yeah. I back in my day, I sound like an old man, but I used to call it progressive bands, right?
Sure.
Like Yes or Rush. Mm-hmm. Would that be similar?
No, so post-rock is kind of more like, I want to say kind of shoegazy, dreamy, that kind of chill versus prog. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So now I get it. So shoegazer. I get. Okay.
Sure, totally.
Total. Okay. That's so awesome.
Yeah.
All right. So you're studying, in your formal training, you're putting in, I'm sure, countless hours in practice, and then you're going out and doing these gigs. And is that how you're cutting your teeth in the Chicago scene? Then you're kind of developing your
In Chicago, I was still primarily doing classical music. Just and doing a lot of casuals, teaching, playing with regional orchestras. But I also had a quartet that was kind of advertising itself as wanting to play more with bands, and record if they wanted strings on their project. So we started collaborating with different artists in town. I started getting called for when headliners come to town, that do the pickup string orchestra, like Trans-Siberian Orchestra, that kind of thing.
Let's park there for a minute. That's really cool. A lot of musicians who don't play an orchestral based instrument are might not be as familiar with that concept. So talk about when the larger acts come into town and hire pickup musicians. What is that experience like?
Sure.
Did that have to happen through the local union or just through contractors that you knew?
Right. It depends. I mean, some of it's union, some of it isn't. But yeah, basically, like what you're saying, the stereotype is a bit true that strings are expensive. We're often, kind of the last instruments to be added, the icing on the cake, with the people who have the full, robust budget, but often are not chosen to tour, with the core band. So a lot of bands do want to have strings, for their show that they're touring, but they hire a lead string player, or the MD hires, players city to city that just come in, usually do a rehearsal, a little run through early day of at the venue, and then we'll play the show in the evening.
Right. Yeah. A good buddy of mine, Tarek Akoni, do you know him, a guitar player?
I don't know.
Okay. He's the MD for Josh Groban. And before COVID, of course, these last handful of years, I think they were doing just that. They were hiring local orchestras.
Sure. Yeah.
To perform with Josh Groban.
Yeah, I have some friends, I think, that probably did like San Diego, LA, that little past run. Mm-hmm.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. Very cool. Okay. So something else that I like to talk about with, it's interesting with the more, what's the word that we used to use in school? I went to a performing arts high school. For the classical players, we used to call you legit. There you go.
Or square,
Or square.
That works too.
That's funny. I'm a guitarist by trade. That's what I always played. Of course, I play a little bit of everything, but I don't play any, orchestral or stringed instruments in that manner. But we always used to refer to you guys as the legit players. Tell us about the experience with violin crossing over to viola. Is it very similar? And were you ever shunned out because you were into more, a broader range of styles?
Sure. So viola, I think the easiest thing, the fastest way that I like to explain it to people who might not be super familiar with all the string instruments is if we think about vocal range, because everybody kind of knows where their voice fits in. So I like to say the violin is the soprano voice and the viola is the alto voice. So that shows you what range they both cover, but then, the range that those alto singers can hit that not everyone can hit.
That's the simplest and most accurate description I've ever heard of that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Please use it. I've found it when somebody shared that with me. I was like, yes, this is it.
Yeah, it's like bass or guitar. You get the low frequencies or the mid frequencies. There you go. Okay.
Exactly.
Beautiful.
But yeah, so I picked up viola when I started getting more interested in chamber music, so learning how to play in a quartet and whatnot. And for those that aren't super familiar with orchestral instruments, viola is actually shunned within the orchestra itself. A little bit of being a runt. There are a lot of jokes. They often say like viola players are the ones that have the least skilled chops. So nobody wanted to play it, but I was like, hey, I'll do it. And that is my primary instrument. These days, I love playing the inner voice, being that person that's kind of the go-between.
You could do so many beautiful harmonic movements.
Sure.
In that little range that, oftentimes goes unnoticed, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. That's very cool.
Yeah, but going to what you're saying then about if other classical players were not as excited about or didn't take as seriously my other interests. Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
that's something that's still, I mean, everybody kind of likes to place people in areas,
In
in
boxes.
boxes.
Yes. Yes.
Even in LA, a little bit. It's always a little bit of a dance. Still coming from a classical background, trying to make sure that I'm not pigeonholed and only hired for certain things, because I do believe I have a skill set to do a variety of things, and I'm equally interested in a variety of things. That's
There
what
you,
makes it more fun.
there you go. One of the big premises for the career musician platform is versatility. It's something that I've always harped on. I'm a big fan of the session players, the LA session players from back in the day,
Sure.
60s and 70s, 80s, when they used to do 3 and 4 sessions a day. And those were the glory days. And, those players would always talk about the more versatile you were, the more hired you would get, the more job opportunities were presented. So to me, I love that. And secondly, I love what you just said. I get bored really easily as well. So I like to keep things interesting. And if you're moving, like, 1 minute you could be doing a classical piece for a film. Next minute you could be doing something, more contemporary for a TV show or a band project, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And your roster, your resume, your credits are just like that. I love the fact you go from, Ariana Grande and Beyonce to all these orchestral projects.
Right.
So expound on that a little bit. Do you have a process that you go through, even like a little mental process that you go through to say, okay, now I'm going to switch and do this, or.
In terms of how I'm trying to hustle, or just when I
Oh,
walk into the room for those different kinds.
right.
Yeah.
When you walk into the room, I know for me, I've always, before I go into a session, whatever style of music, I listen to that style of music for at least 30 minutes prior, right?
I see.
Just to kind of
Sure.
get, in the
Yeah.
groove.
And then I think it's just a big attitude and energy thing too, because,
Right.
classical players tend to be a little bit more rigid and more serious, right?
Right.
And a lot of, film scoring stuff too is very tied to the clock with the Union 10. People are
Mm-hmm.
very protective of that. In a lot of pop scenes, that's not the case.
That's right.
And so you can be cool with it or you can't. You can be flexible with having notes on the page or no notes on the page, and how you, interact and behave in those environments, determines if you're going to be called back or not.
Once again, you're hitting on all of the key components of what I think makes, the epitome of a career musician. That attitude, that openness, that open-mindedness, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've seen it. I've seen it so many times. So let's talk about going from the symphonic stage to the sound stage.
Sure.
Uh, Although similar, still different. There's different types of regiments and rules and guidelines, it seems like. But then again, it still is similar. What's that like for you? Especially in the beginning, I guess, when you first transitioned
Sure.
out here to the big sound stage.
Yeah, and to be honest, I never had any big lofty goals of like I want to move to LA and become a session like scoring player.
Wow.
Um,
Okay.
but when I did make my way out here and realized, oh, this is, a big part of the industry, especially for string players, a big part of the city and the scene, I was like, cool. Yeah, why not? Like, I'd love to be a part of it. What do I need to do? Okay, click. And so I'd say for the first year and a half, when I was getting very few calls, when I was at home, I would always and only practice with the metronome. The metronome would just be on 24/7 because I realized like that's the setting, right? It's very different from orchestral music where the
That's right.
phrases are more loose. You have the conductor. So that was a big thing for me, was just being like, okay, this is the skill that I really need to hone in on.
That's right. So true. So true. And then Union 10, you mentioned. Talk
Sure.
about that for our listeners who might not be familiar with the union regulations.
Sure. So when you're on a union gig, especially scoring gig, specifically every hour, there is a mandated 10-minute break. And there's, clocks all over the building to remind you when that's going to happen and when you need to get your butt back in your seat.
What's the first thing you do on the 10 as soon as the light goes off?
Oh, I mean, I would hate to say check my phone, but
Yeah.
I would say since we're talking about being career musicians, that is a big part of it, in that you have to always be on the ball checking to see if you got a call for something and if you need to respond as fast as you can.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
so true. Yeah, man, I remember when the Palm Pilot first came out. This is some years ago. I was in love with that because it was the first rendition of a smartphone, really.
Sure.
And yeah, that thing was just glued to my hip. And that's when I first moved out to LA. And I think you're right. Well, no, you are right. I mean, as if you respond immediately, your chances of your name just keep going higher and higher on that short list are very good.
And I think that was true even prior to smartphones, because I have a bass player, Carol Kay. I have her book that she wrote about her, her crazy history and all of her stories. And she writes about on the 10s, everybody running to the phone to call in to check their answering machines for the same reason.
That's right, Carol Kay. Yeah, she's exactly one of those players I'm talking about from the glory days. Yeah.
Yeah. So
cool. All right, so are you working on anything currently right now that you can talk about, that you're at liberty to talk about, that might be fun or interesting? Or
a lot of different stuff. It's different every day. This morning I just finished comping and sending off some stems for a TV show that I'm recording for basically every week.
Nice.
There's a documentary that just came out I recorded for called Stone Locals, about the climbing scene, rock climbing scene that Patagonia put out. And then a lot of random stuff for different artists that nothing's been released yet. So,
right.
Yeah.
I noticed on your list of credits, you worked on the last season of The Good Place.
Yes, yeah.
My wife and my daughter and myself, that's one of our favorite shows. A lot of fun. What was that like? Were you still doing sessions, or was it remote?
So all of that was still in person, and that's really fun. A lot of the sessions are held at the composer David Schwartz's house. And it's a pretty small instrumentation per session, which is, I really enjoy. Like, I personally kind of prefer the smaller sessions because it's just more intimate. You have more time with the composer themselves and then with the players. So that's usually, 6 to even just 2 people per episode. Right. Yeah.
It's much easier to connect, isn't it?
Yeah.
On a personal level. Yeah. I remember I did quite a bit of work with John Powell on, a bunch of different films, and I would always be an overdub guy.
Right.
So I was always going to his home studio, much similar to Mr. Schwartz. And it would just, a lot of times it would be he and I and maybe a couple of his assistants, And I have to say, that is definitely fun when you get to be, one-on-one with the composer, or, one-on-one with a handful of people. You get to connect, and it's not an opportunity that always presents itself, right?
For sure. And I would say that to me has been like the biggest silver lining of everything going almost 100% remote, is that it's given me the opportunity to have more of those moments where it really is the back and forth directly with the composer versus kind of being lost in the sea of 70 players, like on a big scoring stage.
Right. Absolutely. Now, I know you've done a ton of studio work and you're still doing that. That's so amazing. Have you done any touring work, or have you kind of stayed away from that?
I haven't done much. I do fly dates, for festivals and stuff with a handful of artists, every season. And I would say it was kind of a personal goal to try to hop on a big tour within the next 2-3 years prior to COVID hitting. But because, studio work has been happening so much here, everything that I've been offered so far, I have passed on just because it was worth it for me more to just stay and keep doing my thing here and keep growing connections here in town.
That's so true. There is the whole stigma of the in-town versus out-of-town cats, I know I lived in Nashville for a while, and they used to say, look, if you're a road dog, you're not getting the studio calls. So I did everything I could to stay off the road because
Sure.
I wanted the studio calls, and I think it's the same out here. And like you say, a lot of ways we've progressed and evolved, but in a lot of ways things kind of stay the same. So I think that's a smart move.
Yeah, I mean, if the opportunity ever comes back, and it makes sense, it would be fun. I've had plenty of friends that go out and they come back, and the first thing they do is buy a house. So like, that's an appealing that's an appealing thing for sure.
Absolutely. Okay, well, let's talk about health and lifestyle. What do you do I know I'm shifting gears abruptly here, but what do you do, especially now? I guess it's kind of tough, right? We're all locked up. What do you do to stay healthy and, keep the old bones and muscles moving?
Yeah, I've always said that like my soul is not into exercise.
Okay. I can relate to that.
It's just I was not built with that being an enjoyable thing, but I have been pushing myself to do that, to get out regularly and be moving, because it is so easy just to be sitting in the studio editing tracks, and then once you're done with that, you go move to the couch, and then you put on a show, and then you've just been sitting.
That's right.
So trying to be active, getting into a little bit of running. So odd to say. Any friends that potentially listen to this will just be rolling over, being like, "What?" But
how about hiking? Have you ever tried hiking?
For sure, I do. I love hiking. But that takes a little bit more time out of the day, right? To choose somewhere, or maybe drive out to the mountains or whatnot.
Absolutely.
And then just trying to afford myself the headspace and be really in touch with like how I'm feeling, because I think a lot of people can relate, especially in the beginning of lockdown. I was just kind of shell shocked. Your calendar gets wiped for the whole year, and then you kind of feel like, oh, I have nothing going on. What am I supposed to do? Like, what's my purpose? So energy wise, things have kind of picked up again, but still I have to really remind myself, check in, how am I feeling? And like, if that means just doing one cue and taking a breather and then coming back later instead of trying to slam it all in, into one chunk of the day, I'll do that just to make sure that I'm not amping stress levels up more than I need to be.
That is a great point. I find myself allowing my schedule to be more fluid as well.
Yeah.
I think that is important. Yeah, definitely.
Sure.
Yes. Okay. So something I wanted to touch on earlier, and I'm going to tie it back into this whole health thing. When you were younger practicing, how many hours a day typically did you practice?
Yeah. Well, like yourself, I ended up going to a arts high school. I went to a boarding arts high school for my last 2 years in rural northern Michigan. And there it's basically like prep college for the arts. So it was putting in, 4 to 8 hours, depending on what day of the week it was.
Right.
And then, yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, and then that kind of schedule continuing through college.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Were you splitting up the time equally between viola and violin, or did you have more primary?
Sure. My junior year of high school, I was doing both. I was taking lessons and participating in studio classes with 2 different professors. And then when it came time to kind of preparing, like, oh, I need to audition for a music school, for college, I chose to switch just to viola, since that, that range, like we've talked about, is kind of like where my personality sits. And so once I made that change, actually, that summer before senior year, I lived with my professor for a little bit, and he gave me lessons basically every other day. And then I just really ground it out like heavy every day.
Your chops must have been insane during that period. Lessons every other day, and just,
Yeah,
wow.
and then just like, cool. There's no one else around. So what do you do other than practice all day?
Wow. You must have been like Paganini going nuts.
I don't know about that. He was a special case.
Yeah. He's one of my favorites.
Nice.
His 24 caprices. Oh, man.
For sure.
And his 16th caprice I learned on guitar.
Awesome.
It's just like, wow. I love it. And I always like to talk to violinists, the string players, about that, because That's really the only string composer I know is Paganini.
Right. So you got drawn to and chose like the most virtuosic one of them all.
Right, exactly. And it all started with Itzhak Perlman when he did the 24 Caprices. I heard it and I was like, what the heck? Like, it just freaked me out. I think I was like 15 years old. I was like, wow. It's like, back then I was really into heavy metal guitar,
Right.
So it was like heavy metal guitar on violin.
Oh, yeah. It's like the most shredding solos you can get.
Yeah. Neoclassical. That's the birth of it all, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. So the reason why I ask about practice and tie it into health is because I find that posture is a big challenge, right?
Sure.
So I know it might sound weird to some people, but do you practice standing up or sitting?
Most of the time standing up.
Okay. And then do you take breaks? If you're doing here's another tie-in, because back then it was just practicing. Now it's, playing, practicing, and recording. So do you take breaks where if you're recording or practicing, do you sit down for a little while and do some comping? Like, how do you work that in so that way your back doesn't hurt or your posture isn't all contorted?
Well, I'm definitely sitting on a cushy little butt cushion for that reason that I take with me to sessions.
Oh, see, there you go. I know a lot of string players do that. They bring their own little cushion. Yeah.
Yeah, that was something that I started in the past year or so. Took a while for me to not forget it. Everywhere I was going, I would have the contractor or whoever be running after me being like, your cushion.
Oh, right.
But yeah, I would say it depends on the workload for sure. Sometimes I will try to split it up just for ears and physicality wise. Like, okay, do a cue, comp some stuff, record another one.
I love that.
But also still sometimes, if you're in the flow, you might just end up standing for 5 hours and feel it later that evening.
Right. You just have to suffer through it.
I do have one of my brothers. He is a violinist, total shredder. He lives out in Detroit. And he has suffered, I have experienced a little bit of tendonitis, especially in high school. Comes up occasionally now still. And he suffered from that more seriously than I did. So he's shared with me some PT stuff. And the biggest thing I think that's easiest to say without visuals for people too is that he told me is think about the way that you hold your body and then think about the opposite direction for whatever instrument you have. And that's where you need to be stretching in that reverse motion.
Right.
And so that
makes sense.
Been a great tip for just how to think about, what you're holding, whether it's a guitar or violin or drumsticks or whatnot, and make sure you stretch out your muscles out the other way.
Right. That's so good to know. That's a good piece of information. I was going to ask about carpal tunnel or like you said. Now people can't see obviously, but just when you extend your hand out, your forearms out, put your hands in front of you, and you put your fingertips up towards the sky. Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a good starter, and then pull it back and so forth. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's very smart.
I had a professor who would always encourage stretching before practice sessions, which I should probably bring back.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Here in my studio, I have a good the Herman Miller chair, the nice ergonomically shaped one. But I also have some bands. So because you're always using your hands, whether it's like you said, working the computer, the keyboard, or your instrument. So then I take those bands, those giant rubber bands, and I just kind of stretch them out.
Yeah. The amount of comping and just editing and computer work, that's something that I haven't quite figured out physically wise how to protect and stretch out from. But I should try that.
Yeah. Same here. I've been really considering getting a one of those touch screens, the Slate digital touch screens. Mm-hmm. And so that way, I'm thinking that I might not have to use as many keyboard shortcuts if I do that.
Sure. But I should get you in touch. There's a composer who lives down the street from me. He was, I don't know if he's doing his own thing now, but he was Lily Hayden's assistant for a while. I don't know if, and he is like a wizard at tech and DAWs and whatnot. And he has he's written all these scripts. He's got Pro Tools on voice command. And every other week he's sharing some hack he's figured out for that, to really save the muscles for playing and just
Yeah.
for that strain. Because you compose as well, so I'm sure you're, also on all of that.
Yeah, it's constant. And I was telling a buddy the other day that oftentimes I find myself pushing back from my desk so that as I'm working, my arms are extended.
Mm-hmm.
And then that gives relief to my elbow joints.
Sure.
I know that, again, that sounds weird, but, these are all things we have to be,
Well, and I think it's important. It seems like, oh, wow, this is what they chose to talk about. But
I know, right?
it's important, especially now, because so much more. Sure, a lot of people had home studios, were doing remote stuff.
Right.
But I would say most people were still going out and about. And now it really is just all at home.
All inside.
So that strain is happening so much more. And
It's true. All right, we'll make the conversation more exciting. So, first of all, your credits, they're super exciting. Come on. All right. But we touched on that a little bit. We'll touch on some more of it. Here's something I want to talk about.
Sure.
And I think a lot of young players, it's interesting because when we're younger, I feel like our egos are bigger. And the more we get a little older and we wise up a little bit, I feel like our egos get, they get more proportional to reality, right?
Okay, yeah.
Talk about studio etiquette, how you behave in the studio. You talked about your attitude going in with an open mind, but, there is a protocol. There's the composer or producer, and then from there, it's just a line that goes down, the totem pole, if you will. Talk about that, because you've been in some of the biggest Hollywood sessions.
Yeah, and I'm still, I appreciate all the compliments. Looking and listening to a lot of the past episodes, I feel like I'm the baby out of all the the guests still trying to start out here. And so
I think the reason, and if I may, the reason why I make such a big deal about it is because you get it. Although you are a younger player, when I look at your body of work, and I speak with you and I interact with you, you get it. You have the career musician mentality, even at a young age. So
sure.
There you go. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Well, yeah, going into the session, like you said, there's the composer, there's the whoever's on the podium, the conductor or composer, there's the contractor. And then there are a lot of people that have been there for a long time, and this is their home. And they're like, who is this young girl? Where did she come from? So
we're talking about people in their 40s, 50s, 60s,
right.
Like you said, who have been there 20, 30 some odd years. Yeah.
Sure. So, the biggest thing is generally still, if there are no seating assignments, I'll seat myself in the back. I'm not trying to flex anything,
right.
or take anyone's spot. Like, I will have my head with the trumpet bells, like, right behind it for as long as I need to and pay my dues. Because I understand that's,
That's right.
That's what you do.
That's so important. I'm so glad you said that, because brass and strings never like one another.
And they joke about it too. Some of them, but I do appreciate that. And some of the, primary principals and I have joked about that, because we both know kind of where I am at, how many years I've been here, and, how many more years I'll have their bells in my ear until I am not the new kid on the block.
Right.
But we're all still playing the same notes, we're all doing the same thing, making the same music. So I honestly have no issue sitting in whatever chair. Hi, this is Marta Honer, and I'm a career musician.
Your value is not determined by the gig. Learn more by listening to the Career Musician Podcast, streaming everywhere.
Be sure to subscribe to the Career Musician Podcast and like The Career Musician on all social platforms to stay up to date on news and topics that affect your music career.
That's great. So I love that. To sum it up, be willing to pay your dues. I think that's a good summation of the concept.
For sure.
Yeah. And not have a sense of entitlement.
Right. Well, and that's something that I've talked to friends about a lot, is that, and also kind of going back to staying healthy, more of the mentally staying healthy. If we're thinking in our prior life, pre-COVID, everybody's talking about, oh, I have this gig or I'm on this thing. Like, oh, did you hear about this opportunity? Oh, like who got called for that? It wasn't me. And remembering that we chose the life to be freelance musicians, which means no gig is owed to you. If you get called for the gig, that is your gig. And I have to remind myself of that all the time myself, because who doesn't sometimes get a little salty and be like, oh, that would have been so fun. I wish I got called for it. But you know what? I didn't.
I couldn't agree more. That is hilarious. I think we all do that, right?
Right. And now it's a little bit less because there's less less stuff happening, less pressure. But that's a big thing that I always try to remind myself is like, this is what I chose. Like, I'm a freelance musician.
Right.
I don't
That's
have
great
any
advice.
signed contract with a contractor or with a band or whatnot,
That's right. That's right. It's great
Yeah.
advice. What I always say is, as sideman musicians, like you say, independent contractors without a contract, number one,
Sure.
oftentimes, 99.9% of times, we don't have managers. But if you think about it, most of the other entities in our business do. The artist has a manager, the composer has a manager, the producer has a manager,
Sure.
right? Conductors sometimes have, an agency that represents them. Musicians and engineers typically don't have managers. So we do it all our own, which brings me perfectly into the next point. Let's talk about business acumen. What are some of the things that you've learned and if you've been putting into practice in the business side of things? And then B of that question would be, let's talk about how you interact with contractors, because that's a big part of what you do.
Sure. I think part of the business is just being professional. And in college, there was a conductor of an orchestra who had a crazy reputation and was like pretty demanding. He was like, you have to be in your seat 20, 30 minutes before the university even scheduled class. Otherwise, I consider you late. If I email you, you need to email me back within, X number of hours, even with just an okay kind of thing. And was pretty severe and strict in general in his training when we were playing. And, at the time, as college students, you're just like, oh man, this guy's such a pain and whatnot. But it trains you into a level of professionalism that really is helpful on the business side. And especially when you move to a new city like I did with basically zero connections, being a quick responder and being polite and being like, yes, absolutely, or I'm available, I'm not available, even just letting them know, making sure you're on time, have all the gear that you need for that specific gig.
That's right.
Goes a long way. Having a positive attitude, saying thank you, doing your best when you're on the gig.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Is what's going to stand.
And the reason why I point it out is because, again, another premise of TCM that I hold in high regard is the R word, relationships.
Sure.
This business is especially about relationships, because we don't have a vast network that we can tap into or be plugged into automatically by default. We actually have to prove all of our actions in order to get plugged in.
Right.
Which means you have to develop relationships. And people often forget relationships don't happen like that, right?
Absolutely.
It takes time. And, I appreciate your perspective, because people need to hear this. Don't get upset if you don't get that call right away. It might take you a year. It might take you 3 years. You know what? I just did a job for somebody that I've known for 9 years who just finally called me for work.
Yeah.
You just never know how long it's going to take.
Yeah, absolutely. And then in the meantime, you just keep on doing you, playing the best you can, showing up on time.
That's right. That's right.
And I think it's interesting it might be fun to talk about, like when you're mentoring in relationships. That was a big thing that I was trying to figure out when COVID hit, was like, how do you continue to hustle? How do you try to continue to build relationships that were just starting, or build new ones, which were constantly trying to do because we chose to be free agent freelance hustlers.
That's right.
When you can't meet in person.
Mm.
And that's a big reason why I made the video you mentioned that kind of promos my remote recording.
Let's talk about that.
Sure.
You crushed that video.
Thank you. So at the beginning of quarantine, I just made a little demo that showed my home studio, talked about my ability to record at home, showed some of my gear and my process. And yeah, it was a way to just let people know that I was available and had that skill set. And I also really wanted to have it showcase and kind of pull the curtain away a little bit for composers that maybe haven't worked with musicians remotely and maybe were kind of on the fence, like, oh, how is this going to work? Do they know what they're doing? And make them feel a little bit more comfortable with the idea.
That's right. That's right. So cool. So wait a minute. Did you shoot and edit that video yourself?
My partner, he filmed it. We FaceTimed our friend who's a filmmaker, and he helped set up the camera settings for us.
Okay, good.
But then I learned Premiere on my own. I just downloaded that and took a week and spliced it all together. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a timely process, isn't it?
For sure. Absolutely.
Yes.
Another skill in the toolbox.
There you go. Another skill in the toolbox. Exactly. Well, for those listening who might not have seen this video, you can go to Marta's website and check it out. It's really cool. And if you click on the work section, the remote recording section, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And it's just martasofiahoner.com. And you can see that video. If you're wondering how to do a self-promotional video, this is the only example you'll ever need.
Thank you very much.
I said you crushed it. So yeah, I mean, this is something that I like I said, I hold in high regard. So, because let's face it, like you said, keeping those relationships consistent and continuing to cultivate themselves, and then also, the fine line between bragging, boasting, and, like you say, pulling back the curtain, letting people know that you're here.
Sure.
That's a delicate balance.
Oh, it is. And I wrote several drafts of my little voiceover script because I was super conscious of that. And even still, when posting it was like, oh man, I hope colleagues don't think that I'm feeling all this and that about myself.
Right. Yeah, I know. Yeah. I know that feeling. I know exactly what you're talking about. Wow. You get a little nervous inside.
For sure. Because, I mean, it's vulnerable. And putting out a promotional video in which you're predominantly speaking is also very different than like, oh, here's a video of me playing, which is something that we're all, I would say, fairly comfortable with. And that's what we're known for, is how we play.
Very true. Very true. All right, let's talk about something else. And maybe, it's probably not as much of a big deal now, but especially when you were doing live dates with, the contractors, did you ever have to sub out?
Yeah. What
was that process like? Because that's a delicate, scenario as well.
Man, two things when I moved to LA that I was like, oh, wow, these things are really new to the city that I've got to figure out and adapt was people seem to sub out all the time because there's always some other crazier gig that happens to pop up last minute. And I've also had to hunt down money a lot more in LA. So too, not so much now. I've figured out how to kind of lock that one in for the most part. But yeah, the subbing thing, I mean, is undeniable because the way the industry works is crazy. Like I know people always talk about the golden age, which, we hear stories about and wow, wouldn't that be awesome to participate in? But I am a few decades younger. But there still is a lot happening. And especially on the pop side, things can happen so quickly, as I'm sure they're working on a track and, oh, wouldn't it be cool to call them up, see if they can come over right now.
That's right.
And then, then it's 50-50 whether you make it to the studio before they say, actually management said we don't have budget, so never mind.
I've called several people at 1:00 in the morning and be like, hey, can you get to the studio?
Right. Yeah, but subbing, it's a delicate balance. I think there are some instances when it's okay, and there are some instances in which it's not worth it. And so that's something that you always have to consider going back to the relationships. Is it worth potentially straining a relationship and saying like last minute, hey man, not going to be there? Or is it something that maybe you have enough time, you can find a really solid replacement for them. It's not going to be any sweat off their back.
That's right. And I would say for those relationships that have, that you've garnered a vast amount of work from, be very, especially careful with those.
Sure.
Yeah. Don't be so quick to sub, because that is a great way to lose it. Right. And there are so many talented people. It's just the bottom line.
Absolutely.
Right? So, we're not in shortage of talented musicians by any means.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So throughout the conversation, you've been sharing some great, some of your principles and methods and everything that you do to continue to curate your career. Any memorable moments that stand out? Like, a famous composer or a famous artist, did something when you're on set, or, whatever, or I don't know, just something fun.
Oh, man.
Or embarrassing.
I'm sure I've got, there's plenty of, crazy casuals gigs.
Right. I'll give you an example. I did a gig with Stevie Wonder, right?
Yeah.
On his records, the Superstitious, right? Superstition, very superstitious. That song is in E flat. Okay. So we didn't rehearse. We're just up there playing. And I started playing in E flat. But it was so loud and the monitors were so terrible. There was no in-ears. I couldn't hear that everybody else was in E. So Stevie Wonder on the microphone goes, guitar player, E, E.
Oh, no. That's when
Talk about it. That's embarrassing, right?
Yeah, that's when you start to really sweat.
Yeah, and that's when I first moved out here too. So there you go.
Oh my gosh.
That's my story.
He's a bucket list person I would love to play with at some point.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's hard to pick. There's been so many super special, moments. I would,
right.
And one thing I will say is that I really appreciate working with people that just have a command to make everyone play so much better and be so on point all the time, because that just makes a really, exciting feeling when everybody's just a little bit on edge, but to make it be their best.
That's a great feeling, isn't it? When you're a little on edge, but it's going to be awesome.
Right. And I feel like Beyoncé is one of those people
There you go.
where she just has such a commanding presence. She's so powerful when she sings. She's obviously such a big icon that it forces you to be like, all right, I have to be 100% of the time. And when you have everyone in the room being 100 for hours rehearsing the same set over and over, can be pretty magical.
Yeah, speechless. I think we both just exuded that.
Sure.
Definitely. All right. So you said you came out here and you weren't really trying to be a big session player or anything, but you came out here, you built a career for yourself, you're hustling. Any advice for somebody, especially from your age demographic, that's saying, you know what, I live in Idaho, I live wherever, and in Florida, but I want to go to LA and really, hustle a career in the biz. What advice would you give them?
Do your research. That's the biggest one. And I've had a few people reach out, that are younger string players that are still in school or whatnot, that say, oh, I saw you on stage with so-and-so. I would love to do that kind of thing. How do you do it? Right. And I was like, do your research, figure out, who are the contractors, and especially for artists, who are the MDs? Start following, simple as following an MD on social media and seeing what they're up to, what projects they're involved in, what artists they work with, and starting to get the lay of the land so that when you do go into a room, you kind of already, even if you're new, you kind of already know where things stand. I think is a really important skill. And I did a lot of internet searching and whatnot moving here to figure out that kind of stuff, to see where I could fit in.
Right. No, that's brilliant. And that is necessary. What was the prompt then? You said you didn't have hopes of being, this career musician. What was the prompting?
Well, I've always had hopes of being a career musician. That was always kind of like the MO, was just like, yeah, you're going to be a freelance player. I, in Chicago, thought I was going to be more of chamber music, casuals, teaching, whatnot. When I decided to move, a big reason for moving was to have a larger city to freelance in that would have more opportunities. But I didn't have, like being a session player as one of those like pinnacle, like, yeah, this is the goal. It was much more open. And then being here and getting the lay of the land, that's when I started to see where I could fit in and starting to research like how I could, make that happen.
Yeah. Good. The last thing I want to hit on before we move to rapid fire, because I can't wait to ask you some fun questions.
Sure.
You mentioned earlier, you're like, yeah, I was always hustling for money, but then I kind of figured it out. What's your advice there? Because I know I have tons of advice about money management, but what did you learn?
Yeah. So in that context, I think I was kind of saying like hustling down the money owed.
Oh, that's a whole nother great point. We're talking about accounts receivable, folks.
Right. Yeah.
That's huge.
Following up on my invoice per prior.
Yes. Net 30, net 60, net 90. Yes.
Yes, absolutely. No, I think in terms of money, I actually have had a fairly good idea of what it would take. Okay. Like I mentioned, my mom runs a violin school. My dad casually, he has a straight job, but he's a musician as well. He would do bar gigs and whatnot. They had a lot of friends that were freelance musicians. So I kind of saw what the lifestyle was like growing up. So for me, it wasn't really necessarily a surprise as to what it would take, and that in order to make it work long term without freaking out constantly, it would require some money management. Mm-hmm. But that being said, it took a while until a friend and I were chatting about money and them saying, hey, you need to, as creatives, we often think like, oh, obviously we would like to get paid. We would prefer paid gigs. But at the end of the day, money is not our number one priority, right? Making art, being creative, that's our number one priority. So true. And what she really coached me on was you can still maintain that belief and moral system or whatnot, what have you, but also believe that you're deserving of and that money is still important to you. And I think once I was like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. It helped me more with my budgeting and saving and choosing of gigs and, what I decided my rates were, how much I was worth and whatnot. That all kind of changed after that.
That's right. Wow, that's great. That's great. Another thing I tell people is set aside time in the day to do your administrative work. And, part of that is invoicing, and not only invoicing, but first of all, learn how to, craft a proper invoice.
Yes.
Right. And then secondly, send the invoice attached to a very well-written email. Make sure you're articulate and polite, like you say. And then the third part of that process is following up. If you don't hear something within the next 1 to 3 days after you sent it, follow up and say, hey, just check it in to make sure you received my invoice. If there's anything else I could do for you, but right? The whole deal, And then, like I said, net 30, which means you're expecting payment within 30 days.
Absolutely.
And that's in an ideal world. But
Yeah.
in our world, sometimes it's net 6 years.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. It's
Oh man, I'm exaggerating, but you get it.
yeah. Sometimes it feels like 6 years.
Right. So yeah, that's good stuff. Good stuff. All right. Well, this has been amazing, and I appreciate those words of wisdom for everybody listening out there. Now let's do some rapid fire questions.
Sure.
Okay, I'm just going to ask you. Don't think about it, and just say the first thing that comes to mind. Drum roll, please. Favorite food?
Oh, probably tacos.
Nice.
Yeah.
Good for California, right?
Absolutely.
Favorite libation, adult beverage, if you have any.
Sure. Mezcal.
Ah, good one. Favorite sport?
Soccer was my favorite. I will say
Nice.
I've been getting into watching sports documentaries during our little quarantine too, though. There's
That's
a lot.
fun.
There's so much focus and practice aligned that athletes do alongside musicians.
Yes, I was to say I love watching them in their practice sessions.
Yeah,
Incredible. Yeah. And how do you spend your free time?
Oh, well, these days, partially vegging on the couch, like we aforementioned, and then doing research on new things.
There you go.
So doing a lot of research on getting better at engineering, different gear for the studio, and then doing a lot of research, coming from a classical background, which is considered very Eurocentric, doing a lot of research on the music in my, original genre that has been not told, right? I didn't know until this year that there was a composer and violinist who lived around the same time as Mozart that was just as famous, if not more, but he was Black. So trying to really kind of like decolonize the whole classical genre for myself and be more informed and educated.
How cool is that?
Yep.
What was the composer's name?
His name is Chevalier.
Chevalier.
George
Wow.
Chevalier.
What was his first name?
Let me pull
Oh,
this
you don't
up right
know?
now.
Yeah.
St. George Chevalier, I believe.
Ah. I'm looking it up now. I like that.
Yeah, lived around the same time period. Chevalier de St. George. He also lived in the same area too. I mean, so many different composers.
Incredible.
So many different players of amazing music. And I still do teach some. So I think it's so important to try to stay as educated as possible and teach this to kids too, so that they don't get a spotty history training like I did.
That's right. I'm looking at his Wikipedia now. Joseph Boulogne Chevalier de St. George, right? Yeah.
Yep.
Wow. And I'm probably screwing up the pronunciation. So cool. Okay. From 1745 to 1799. See, that's great. Now, on this note, pardon the pun, tell us about lessons. If somebody wants to study with you, how do they do that?
Sure. I don't actually teach any private lessons right now. If people are interested, they can shoot me an email through my website. We can sort something out and we can Zoom. But the teaching I primarily do now is for a program in LA called the Harmony Project, which is an after-school nonprofit program for underserved kids all around the city.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Okay, and I'm checking that out now as well. HarmonyProject.com. You can find out more information about that. All right. Oh, we're supposed to be in rapid fire.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I just pulled us.
It's my fault. It's my fault. I never pay attention to rapid fire, even though that's what I call it. Okay. So what activities did you enjoy on long flights when you had them occasionally? Because you said you did some fly dates.
Yeah. I cannot sleep on planes.
Right, I'm the same way.
So I usually just watch 2-3 movies, like catch up to whatever's out.
There you go. The latest song, band, or artist that you've listened to that you did not work on.
Ooh.
In other words, the music that you've listened to just for fun, dare I say.
Dare I say, I haven't been.
I'm the same way.
It's hard. I used to listen to so much more music. And of course, if I'm going to be working with an artist that I haven't before, I'll make sure I do a deep dive and get super familiar.
There you go.
But, after a long day of rehearsal or recording at home, I don't turn on the tunes.
I know. How about this? When you do veg on the couch and you're Netflixing it away,
Sure.
and you get distracted by how good the score is. Has that ever happened to you?
Sure, yeah.
I'm like, oh man. And all of a sudden, I'm sitting here analyzing the score. And my wife is like, what are you talking about? I'm like, oh, sorry. I was just analyzing the score. She's like, I was so involved in the movie and now you just ruined it for me.
Uh-huh. Absolutely. There's another podcast I listen to all the time, Score, the podcast by the same guys who put out the Score documentary. And they interview film composers every episode.
Yes.
So that's super fun because, for sure, I am always tuning into the score, and even more so since moving to LA. And so it's really fun to hear people's stories behind their workflow process and specific films and whatnot. Yeah. Exactly.
All right, moving right along. Favorite TV show that you're streaming or movie, if you have one?
Sure.
Or
right
several?
now, I started Lovecraft County on HBO, and that's cool actually because the score is being recorded as we speak remotely. And so I have a lot of friends. There's a new project that has sprung out of quarantine called the Unison Orchestra that a colleague, a violinist in town, co-founded. And so they have musicians all over the states actually that are remote recording for that.
Nice. I'm checking that out as well. Okay. You are a treasure trove of resources. I love this. And shopping online or brick and mortar?
Online.
Yeah, it's just easier.
I'm like, I will sit and read reviews all day.
That's funny. I always hate reading the reviews.
There's some wild ones.
Yeah, there are. All right, dream collaboration. You mentioned Stevie Wonder.
For sure. Yeah, that would be an artist. He's like a dream artist that I have not played with that I would love to.
Right.
And then it's so cheesy and potentially a little bit too late in time, but obviously like recording for a Star Wars film is like a dream. Would be a dream score.
That would be pretty sick.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Well, you never know with Unison Orchestra and things like that, popping up.
For sure. And the studios, some of the studios in town are open. I have done a few smaller in-person things.
Right. Everybody's wearing a mask and so forth.
Yeah. And little dividers. I did a session for a couple days the other day, and they had little dividers for us as well.
Right.
Which the MD was very excited about, to have even more sound isolation in between all of us.
That's right.
So
That's right.
Works two ways.
Better for mixing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And finally, what would you do if you weren't a career musician?
Oh, man. Yeah, I always joke, right? Because it's like if I couldn't play anymore, I don't really have any other skills.
I know. I'm in the same boat, man.
But, I'd say I'm a pretty organized person and I love solving problems. So probably some sort of like arts admin kind of gig would make sense for me.
Perfect. It all falls in line.
Yeah, absolutely.
I like it. Well, Marta, big shout out to our mutual friend Eric G for hooking this up.
Absolutely. Hey, Eric.
Yes, and he speaks very highly of you, and he was 100% correct. So,
well, thanks to him. Yeah, we met when we were both grinding it out.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. Very cool. So thank you so much for being a guest on the Career Musician Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Making music is easy. Making money in music is not. Join Nomad as he talks about the ups, downs, and turnarounds of the music biz.
Want to learn more about a particular topic? Tag @TheCareerMusician and use #CareerMusician to let us know what you'd like to hear.
I'm just a nomad, nowhere man, writing the songs in this one-man band. A nomad,
This is Nomad, host and creator of the Career Musician Podcast, and I am thoroughly stoked to be an official member of the Pantheon Podcast Network. Pantheon Podcast Network is the first of its kind as an all-music-based podcast collective. Please be sure to check us out at pantheonpodcast.com for more info.